Inmates escaping prisons isn't exactly a rare thing, but when they do, it's usually just a handful of them, and in spectacular fashion. You might be thinking about Clint Eastwood as Breakout in The Shawshank Redemption or the great prison bus escape from Green Mile, but those are fiction. What's even cooler is real life, how 7 guys escaped from a maximum security prison by stealing a truck and then spent a month on the run killing cops. That happened in Texas in 2000, and like everything else in Texas, everything was bigger. 7 inmates make the Texas 7, not just your average run-of-the-mill criminals. This was a who's who of convicted murderers and violent offenders. There was George Rivas, the mastermind behind the whole operation. He was serving a 17-year sentence after pleading guilty to burglary and sexual assault. Then there was Joseph Garcia, done for armed robbery. His criminal record dated all the way back to 1977 when he was caught stealing cars. Michael Rodriguez, the getaway driver for a fatal drug deal gone wrong in Houston. And of course, there was Larry Harper, a former death row inmate himself. His original conviction for murder was overturned due to incompetent counsel, but he was retried and given a life sentence. Also included was Daniel Troxell, whose ex-wife had been murdered. Her throat was slashed so deeply that her head almost got severed. Just awful stuff. And finally, 2 brothers, Randy and Patrick Murphy. They were charged with taking part in a drug-fueled crime spree that left 2 people dead. Now, ordinarily, this bunch of criminals would never get together without starting a fight, but that was the genius of George Rivas. He knew how to play the long game and manipulate people into doing what he wanted them to do. So when Rivas arrived at the Connolly unit in September 1998, he began playing the role of peacemaker. As he put it later, "I had a good personality. I was very friendly with everybody, inmate and staff. It helped me out because I was able to get close to a lot of guys who didn't get along. It also helped that Rivas was extremely intelligent, more than your average Joe and high school educated. It turns out he had a knack for engineering and could solve complex problems, which would become obvious once the plan he'd been cooking up was set in motion." It went down on December 13, 2000. At about 6 p.m., the men were getting ready for dinner. Some of them would have TVS in their cells, others played dominoes, cards, or watched wrestlers grapple in the yard through a window. Not knowing that in a few minutes they'd all be locked down, one guard noticed 2 inmates getting into a fight. So he ordered everyone to return to their cells and lock the doors. Now, as he walked away, one of the inmates yelled, "Hey, guard, we want some dominoes," which was total nonsense, but the guard assumed they were bored and maybe hoping for something to pass the time. So he asked them to write down their request and promised to see what he could do. A few minutes later, he returned empty-handed. He said the dominoes would be delivered the next day, if they're lucky. That's when the first punches were thrown. The inmates busted open the cell door and poured out into the hallway. The guard started sounding the alarm. They raced to the mess hall, overpowering another guard and finding a third one tied up inside. They must have heard the commotion outside and figured the place was going up in flames. One of the inmates pulled the guard out of the closet and tied him up with the telephone cord. That's pretty messed up. Meanwhile, the rest of the gang stormed the prison kitchen and grabbed some meat cleavers, axes, and knives. Their eyes were now set on the prison garage, where they snatched 3 pickup trucks and 2 vans. One of them drove straight into a concrete pillar, but the other 5 vehicles were loaded up with tools and supplies. They hitched a ride on a tractor-trailer that was supposed to pick up some sewage, but dumped its cargo and drove off anyway. From there, they were on their way. This prison break was one for the history books. The men had stolen a truckload of weapons and prison equipment, probably in preparation for any uncomfortable situations down the line. But that doesn't mean they were free yet. They needed to lay low for a bit. So they drove to a nearby ranch owned by one of Rivas's accomplices, where they laid low for a few weeks, drinking beer, eating corn chips, having a blast while watching the news report on their daring escape. But eventually they ran out of food and the desire to hide. They were on the road again, heading west into separate vehicles. Now, according to Rivas, the idea was to drive all the way to Mexico, where they'd received word that 2 boats would be waiting to take them across the border. But the men had no money and their fuel was running low, so they made a decision to rob a car dealership in San Angelo, Texas. Wearing ski masks, they marched the employees to the safe, making off with $1,500 in cash, checks and credit cards, along with 14 guns and lots of ammo. At this point, the authorities were hot on their trail, and the men realized that they couldn't stay in Texas much longer. They piled into 2 cars and drove straight into the sunset. But they soon found themselves low on gas again and needing some cash. So they decided to rob a convenience store. While 2 men waited in the car, Garcia and Harper walked into the store and demanded money. The clerk complied, giving them roughly $400, as well as 2 boxes of Twinkies. With their bellies full of sugary snacks, they hit the road again, driving north into Oklahoma. And here's where things get a little murky. According to the men themselves, they didn't know anything about a convenience store being robbed in Puritan, Texas, nor did they know that the cops were hot on their tail until they arrived at a house in Oklahoma City, which happened to be owned by another one of Rivas's accomplices. As the story goes, they got a tip from someone at the house that the cops were right behind them. So they decided to drive south to Dallas. On Christmas Eve, the men found themselves in Irving, Texas, where they attempted to siphon gas from a motorist, but were interrupted by the arrival of a police officer. A quick glance at the back of his cruiser was enough for them to know that they were in trouble. So they abandoned the car and fled to a nearby shopping mall, where they hid out until nightfall. That's when they decided to rent a Ford Expedition from a rental car agency. They paid with a stolen credit card and drove off, unaware that they'd left behind their fingerprints. Eventually, they hit the road again, headed west toward Las Vegas, except they never made it. They were pulled over for speeding in Arizona and arrested. But thankfully for them, the police didn't find any evidence linking them to any crimes, so after a night in jail, they were let go. As it turned out, they were free to roam the United States for a few more days, which brings us to the end of the chase. After failing to siphon gas from the car in Puritan, Texas, the police released a composite sketch of the 2 men who robbed the store. Someone saw the sketch and immediately recognized the description and appearance of Garcia and Harper. When they were arrested, they confessed to the robbery. And after their fingerprints were found in the rental car, they admitted to their involvement in the Texas 7 prison break. By the end of January 2001, all 6 men were captured and taken into custody. Meanwhile, Larry Harper took his own life on January 10th, fearing what was to come. The men were tried separately, each given life sentences for their roles in the murder of Irving police officer Aubrey Wright Hawkins, who was gunned down during the robbery at the Texaco station. 4 of the men, including George Rivas, were sentenced to death by lethal injection. Garcia and Harper were sentenced to life in prison. The execution of the first 4 men happened between 2006 and 2013. The last 2, Garcia and Harper, remain behind bars to this day. So why exactly did they kill Hawkins? Well, for Garcia, it was an easy choice. He was already a career criminal and murdering a cop came with the territory. For Harper, it was pure insanity. He suffered from mental illness and had tried to hang himself several times while incarcerated. For Patrick Murphy, he claimed that he felt a sense of euphoria while pulling the trigger. It was too bad, though, because as he put it, "I don't think anyone should die that way." Perhaps the most disturbing statement, though, came from Rivas, who explained why he thought Hawkins had to die. He was an officer of the law, he had a badge and a gun. If he wasn't gonna shoot us, we were gonna shoot him. There you have it. These men didn't just escape from prison, they terrorized an entire state. They made the FBI's 10 most wanted list, they were among the most ruthless criminals in the country, and they weren't afraid to pull the trigger. Thanks for watching.